How do you defeat an enemy that seems unbeatable? A game character with the ability to steal every enemy's power? The simple answer is, you can't. Not by playing their game. The only thing you can do is to find a way to make their perfect system to lag. And to achieve that, you must be willing to break every rule. You must change the game itself. The 13th century, the Mongol Empire has forged the largest, most dominant land empire in all of human history. Now the gaze of the great Khan turns south, to a small, proud kingdom on the coast, Dai Viet. This was never just a simple conquest. It was a strategic move, a consolidation of absolute power. To win the final war for Southern Song, the Khan needed the south to kneel.
The great Khan oversees all under heaven. Bring forth the envoys.
Must learn. I have sent my most seasoned general to teach them a lesson.
In 1258, the first column, led by the veteran general Uriang Kadai, crosses the border from Yunnan. A hardened warrior from the conquest of the Dali kingdom, he was sent to end this meaningless resistance. His army was a multi-ethnic force, seasoned by decades of relentless war. Disciplined and ruthless, they were fast, they were brutal, and they did not know how to forgive. A tidal wave of steel and fury now aimed directly at the heart of the Vietnamese kingdom. In the capital, Thang Long, Emperor Tran Thai Tong understood the deadly peril his people were facing. A direct confrontation on an open field would be nothing short of national suicide.
The Song dynasty could not hold. What defense is left to us?
But the emperor, in a desperate gamble, decides to stand. At Bin Le Noyang, the forces of Dai Viet prepare for the impossible. This battle would be watched by a young, brilliant general, a man named Tran Quoc Tuan. It was a fatal test. A brutal lesson for a new generation of commanders. Paid for in blood, the northern border has fallen. The storm has truly arrived. The battle line is drawn. On one side, the unstoppable Mongol war machine. On the other, the desperate helmeted defenders of Dai Viet. The Vietnamese commanders unleash their secret weapon, war elephants, ancient tanks of flesh and bone. Uriang Kadai, however, has seen elephants before. He is not impressed by this local tactic. General Tran Quoc Tuan watches, knowing this first engagement will decide the fate of the capital. The charge is devastating. The elephants tear through the Mongol front lines, crushing cavalry beneath their feet. For a moment, it seems the tide might turn. The Mongol lines bend, but they do not break. Uriang Kadai calmly gives the order. A storm of arrows is unleashed from the Mongol flanks. But these are not ordinary arrows. They are wrapped in flame, aimed not to kill the elephants, but to enrage them. The plan works perfectly. The panicked elephants, blind with pain, turn and trample their own infantry. The Vietnamese formation collapses completely. The battle is lost in a cloud of smoke and chaos. General Tran Quoc Tuan witnesses the total failure of traditional tactics. A brutal lesson is learned. Emperor Tran Thai Tong is forced to flee the battlefield. The road to the capital, Thang Long, is now wide open.
We follow the river to the capital. Thang Long is the key to victory.
Back in the capital, the emperor must make an impossible, agonizing choice. He gives the order, evacuate the city. Every man, woman, and child must leave. But more than that, destroy everything. Deny the enemy their prize. Leave nothing. This is the Scorched Earth strategy, a tactic that will win the war by sacrificing the homeland. Uriang Kadai leads his victorious army into Thang Long, expecting a triumphant surrender. Instead, he finds a ghost town, an empty city, silent and stripped bare of all supplies. There is no food, no supplies, no plunder for his starving army. The Mongols have captured the capital, but they have walked directly into a trap. The invaders, cut off from supplies and plagued by tropical diseases, begin to weaken and die. The game has lagged. The rules of war have been broken by the Vietnamese. And in the shadows of the jungle, the true Vietnamese resistance was just beginning. Small, relentless ambushes strike the Mongol patrols and their desperate supply lines. The hunter has now officially become the hunted. While the Mongols weakened in the city, the Dai Viet forces regrouped, not on land, but on water. General Tran Quoc Tuan, now on his command boat, prepared his hidden fleet for a decisive strike. Emperor Tran Tai Tong stood on the riverbank, placing his trust in this new, fluid naval strategy. The Dai Viet soldiers were no longer retreating. Their faces were set with grim determination. A fleet of agile, fast Dai Viet warboats began to move swiftly down the Red River towards the unsuspecting enemy. Back in Thang Long, a weary Yuryang Kadai received panicked reports. The Dai Viet forces were counterattacking. His troops, decimated by sickness and hunger, were in no condition to fight a new, organized battle. Their heavy, clumsy transport ships were moored at the Dongbo Dao Wharf, completely vulnerable. The Mongol general desperately ordered his disorganized ground troops to the riverbank, but it was too late. The Battle of Dongbo Dao began. The swift Dai Viet boats swarmed the larger Mongol vessels. Using long poles and hooks, the Dai Viet soldiers boarded the enemy ships, turning the river into a battlefield. Mongol archers on the bank tried to provide cover, but their arrows were ineffective against the fast-moving Dai Viet boats. General Tran Quoc Tuan pointed his sword forward, signaling the all-out assault. Dai Viet infantry leaped onto the Mongol decks, fighting with spears and swords in brutal close-quarters combat. The heavily armored Mongol soldiers had no advantage on the water. Many fell overboard, weighed down by their own steel. The Mongol fleet was devastated. Several ships were set ablaze, sinking into the river. From the riverbank, Yuryang Kadai watched in horror as his fleet, his main supply line, was annihilated. He made the only decision he could. He grabbed his horse's reins and ordered a full, desperate retreat by land. The Mongol army, once the proud conquerors, broke formation and fled north in a panicked rout. A Mongol banner, symbol of an empire, sank quietly into the river mud. The Dai Viet warboats had secured the river. The capital was theirs once more. But for Emperor Tran Tai Tong, the victory was bittersweet. As he looked at the ruins of his burnt capital, the retreating Mongol army struggled through the dense, muddy jungles they had entered so confidently. The sick and the weak were left behind, abandoned by their comrades in the desperate flight. The silhouette of the once invincible army disappeared over the horizon, utterly defeated. The map of Dai Viet was clear once more. The red arrow of the invaders was in full retreat, heading north. As the dust settled, General Tran Quoc Tuan analyzed the spoils of war. His mind was already moving past the victory, analyzing the enemy's craftsmanship, their strengths, their weaknesses. The Emperor Tran Tai Tong joined him on the riverbank, the immediate danger having passed. The two men, the heart and the mind of Dai Viet, surveyed the heavy cost of their freedom. But as the emperor looked away from the victory, he saw the grim reminder of the price they had paid. Thang Long, his capital, was still a smoking ruin, sacrificed for this very moment. The Mongol army, or what was left of it, was finally driven from the borders of Dai Viet. The land was quiet once more. The first storm had been weathered. The map of Dai Viet was clear. The first invasion had been repelled. But this was not a total victory. The Mongol Empire, vast and vengeful, still surrounded them. That night, General Tran Quoc Tuan did not celebrate. He returned to his command tent. He knew this was only the beginning. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The captured Mongol helmet served as a constant reminder of the enemy's strength. And as he planned, he knew the Mongols would return. 27 years passed. Thang Long, once ashes, was rebuilt. Peace returned to Dai Viet. A new generation was born, unfamiliar with the horrors of the First War. General Tran Quoc Tuan, his skill forged in that first fire, spent these years preparing. He trained a new army, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to think. But while Dai Viet rebuilt, the world changed. The Mongol Empire had finally crushed the last resistance of the Southern Song. The empire was renamed. It was no longer the Mongol horde. It was the vast, organized Yuan dynasty. And Kublai Khan was no longer just a Khan. He was the absolute emperor of a unified China. He was older now, more powerful. And he had a long memory. From his grand palace, he ruled over the largest empire on earth. But one small failure, one humiliation from 27 years ago, still haunted him.
27 years. They have been allowed to live in peace for 27 years. This time, I will not send a general. I will send a storm.
This would not be a border skirmish. This was a full-scale imperial invasion. Hundreds of thousands of troops, the best of the new Yuan dynasty, were mobilized. New ruthless commanders were chosen, veterans of the Song campaign, eager to please their emperor. And this time, they would not just come by land. A massive Yuan fleet, the largest in the world, was assembled. These were not the weary troops of Uriang Kadai. This was a fresh, disciplined, and technologically superior force. Their cavalry was elite. Their infantry, the backbone of the defeated Song, now marched for their new master. The plan was simple, a massive pincer movement. The army would crush Dai Viet from the north, while the fleet blockaded and attacked from the sea. In Thang Long, General Tran Quoc Tuan looked at the reports. He knew. The storm was returning, but this time, he was not a young general learning a lesson. He was the Quoc Kong Tiet-che. He was ready. The old generation, those who remembered the First War, felt the familiar dread. Fear began to spread. How could their small kingdom possibly survive this? But fear, Bo, was tempered by preparation. Dai Viet had spent 27 years sharpening its own spears. The Yuan army reached the border, a river of steel pouring south. They filled the valleys, a force so vast it seemed to blot out the sun. The Yuan fleet appeared on the horizon, a forest of masts covering the ocean. Back in his palace, Kublai Khan waited. He had given the order. Total annihilation.
They taught me a lesson in Scorched Earth. This time, I will teach them extermination.
The vanguard of the Yuan army smashed through the border defenses. The first ships of the Yuan fleet entered Dai Viet's waters. On the walls of his fortress, General Tran Quoc Tuan watched them come. The second, and greatest, war had begun. The first invasion was over. A massive Mongol army, defeated and humiliated, fled back north. For General Uriang Kadai, it was an impossible defeat, a stain on his honor. For Emperor Tran Tai Tong, it was a victory, but one paid for with the ashes of his own capital.
He will return. He They only don't wait to come night waiting then and my on young you wait nine They will pay for this humiliation. They will pay.
But would Kublai Khan, now the most powerful man on earth, simply abandon Dai Viet? Or would this act of defiance, this humiliation, only guarantee a more terrifying return? The answer, it will be waiting. 27 years after the first failure. This time the Mongols did not send a general. They sent the great Khan's son. This is Prince Thod Hoan. He commands 300,000 troops. This is not an expeditionary force. This is a sea of men.
Move faster!
His army is a lethal combination. Elite Mongol cavalry and conscripted Song infantry. But Kublai Khan was not betting everything on a single attack. The second strike comes from the south, from the lands of Champa. 200,000 troops under Toa Do, one of the empire's most battle-hardened generals, are ready. The plan was clear, a pincer movement. The two armies would converge on Thang Long. If they met, Dai Viet would be cut in two. It would be the end. January 1285. The northern pincer begins to close. The Dai Viet army, led by General Tran Hung Dao, has established a defense line at Van Keep, but the disparity in numbers is too great. Mongol cavalry pours over the line like a flood. Dai Viet weapons are useless against their armor. The Van Keep line breaks. Mongol cavalry pours over the line like a flood. Dai Viet weapons are useless against their armor. The Van Keep line breaks.
Full sail ahead. Maintain course for the
A Tran prince, Tran Tak, decides to flee. Not to fight, but to surrender. He brings with him all of Dai Viet's military secrets. In return, he is promised the title of King of Annam. For Thod Hoan, this is the guarantee of victory. The pincer movement now has a guide. Dai Viet's defense lines are now completely useless. The news hits the court. A prince has defected. 500,000 enemies are closing in. The pincer movement now has a guide. Dai Viet's defense lines are now completely useless. The news hits the court. A prince has defected. 500,000 enemies are closing in.
Tell me, what must I do to save our kingdom?
With the northern border broken and a prince defected, the court at Thang Long is in chaos. The peace faction argues for surrender. But amidst the panic, Tran Hung Dao remains calm. He knows Thod Hoan's army is not the only threat. The true threat is fear. He approaches King Tran. His response is not a military order. It is an act of political genius. He advises the king to convene the Dien Hong Conference. This is not a debate for generals or politicians. He calls for the elders, the very soul of the nation, from every village. King Tran stands before them. He does not command them. He asks them one simple question: should we fight or should we surrender? The response from these old men is not the fear seen in the royal court. It is the wisdom of the land. It is the fury of fathers protecting their homes. They have seen war before. They are not afraid. A single word echoes from the courtyard, spoken not in fear, but in pure, unified rage. Fight! The entire assembly roars as one. The decision is made. King Tran now has his mandate. The psychological victory is won. The fear in the court has been broken. Tran Hung Dao's plan has worked. He has transformed the king's war into the people's war. The response is immediate. Across the army, soldiers and citizens alike begin to prepare. They seek out the tattoo masters for a new ritual. This is not just ink. It is a blood oath. The first character, Sat, to kill. The second character, That, the Mongols. A simple, brutal message: kill the Mongols. The army's morale surges. They are no longer just soldiers defending a border. They are avengers. Every soldier becomes a walking promise of vengeance, a personal contract to fight to the death. But morale is not armor. The UN army does not care about oaths. Thod Hoan is already moving again. His target is the next major stronghold, Van Keep. This is where the main Dai Viet army is stationed. Thod Hoan is annoyed by the delay. He orders his vanguard to push forward, expecting another easy victory. Back in Thang Long, Tran Hung Dao hears the news of the Sathet movement. He knows his psychological tactic worked, but he also knows the reality of the battlefield. The real war is about to begin at Van Keep. The time for talking is over. Tran Hung Dao turns his back on the royal court. He walks to the armory. His court robes are removed. He picks up his general's helmet. The politician is gone. The general has arrived. This is Tran Hung Dao, now in his element. His eyes are cold. He understands the Mongol war machine. He knows morale is not enough. He must meet them. He reviews the maps of Van Keep one last time. He knows the terrain. He knows the enemy. His army is waiting. They see their general in his armor, and their Sat-that spirit roars. He rides out of Thang Long, not to retreat, but to lead the defense of the capital at its outer gate. At the front, Thode Hoan looks toward Van Keep. He is impatient. He wants this war over. He gives the signal. The full might of the Northern Army begins its relentless march. The battle for Thang Long is about to begin. The General Tran Hung Dao arrives at the Van Keep front line. The Sat-that spirit is high. Dai Viet soldiers, their arms freshly tattooed, brace for the impact. They are defending their homeland. But Thode Hoan is not a man who cares for spirit. He commands a war machine. The Mongol assault begins not with cavalry, but with a terrifying barrage from their song engineers. Trebuchets. Massive boulders arc across the sky, smashing into the Dai Viet fortifications. This is 13th century shock and awe. The Dai Viet defenses, built to
Attack! Forward, men! The assault begins now! Forward!
Then, the main assault. Thode Hoan unleashes his heavy cavalry. The Dai Viet soldiers fight with desperation, but the sheer weight of the Mongol charge is unstoppable. The lines begin to buckle. For every Mongol that falls, 10 more take his place. The Sat. That oath is tested in blood. The Van Keep line breaks. It is a catastrophic failure. Tran Hung Dao, watching the rout, must make an impossible choice. He can stand and fight, sacrificing his entire army in a blaze of glory. Or he can do the unthinkable. He can run. He can run. He gives the order. Retreat. This is not the act of a coward. This is the act of a grand strategist. He knows he cannot defeat 300,000 men in a pitched battle.
Word to the fleet. We move with the
So he will not fight their battle. He will make them fight his. The strategy is simple. Keodan. Stretch them. Lure the massive Mongol army deep into hostile territory, far from its supply lines. And to do that, he must give them the prize they crave most. The capital. Thang Long. The order is given. Thang Long is to be abandoned. This is the Scorched Earth tactic. The people evacuate. The granaries are emptied or burned. The wells are poisoned. Nothing is left for the invader. King Tran, in a simple robe, steps onto a small boat. For the second time in a generation, the king of Dai Viet abandons his own capital. It is the ultimate humiliation. Thode Hoan and his vanguard ride triumphantly towards the gates of Thang Long. He has done what Uryan Kadai could not. He has taken the capital. He expects a fierce last stand, a city to plunder, a king to capture. He rides through the gates and finds nothing. The city is empty. The streets are silent. The only sound is the crackle of fires set by the retreating Dai Viet troops. Thode Hoan sits on his horse in the middle of the empty royal court. He has conquered a ghost. His victory is hollow. And as he looks at the burning granaries, a cold realization sets in. Tran Hung Dao has not been defeated. He has just set the trap. The Mongol victory at Thang Long is hollow, but the danger is real. The king flees by boat, consumed by despair. He knows that the Scorched Earth tactic deprived Thode Hoan of food, but it also cost them the capital. He is haunted by the image of the burning citadel. The strategic picture is bleak. The two Mongol pincers, Thode Hoan and Toa Du, are close to linking up, which would spell doom for the remaining Dai Viet forces. The king sees the strategic map unfolding and is consumed by the possibility of utter annihilation. He contemplates surrender.
I am still waiting.
In a quiet moment on the small boat, far from the capital, the king turns to Tran Hung Dao. He speaks the unthinkable question, giving voice to the despair of the entire nation. He is looking for a way out, even if it means submission. He finally asks the question that weighs on the heart of every man on this boat. The silence after the king's question is immense. Tran Hung Dao knows the weight of this moment. Surrender is tempting, but the result would be eternal servitude under Mongol rule. He must anchor the king's resolve in something stronger than temporary fear. He steps forward. He looks straight in the eye. His pledge must not only convince the king, but also commit him fully to the final victory. His words are not merely advice, but a personal, unbreakable oath.
Cut my head first!
The king is silenced. The question is answered, has successfully anchored the king's resolve, and ensured the continuation of the war. The fate of Dai Viet is now clear. Fight to the final breath. The king's resolve is unbreakable. Tran Hung Dao has won the strategic and political battle. Now, the final military game begins. The Mongol forces, victorious in capturing the empty capital, believe the war is over. They are gravely mistaken. The most dangerous phase of the conflict is about to start. The two Mongol armies, Thod Hoan in the north and Toado in the south, must finally converge. The UN strategy is dependent on this pincer movement. Thod Hoan is waiting for his colleague, but the waiting depletes his supplies, and his temper flares. He starts to realize the true intent of the Scorched Earth tactic. His army is starving. Meanwhile, Tran Hung Dao has consolidated his forces and gathered new supplies. He knows that the moment the two Mongol armies meet, they will be at their strongest. He must strike before that link-up is complete.
The enemy is broken.
The hour has come.
Until sunset.
The two Mongol pincers are dangerously close. The stage is set for the inevitable counterattack. The fate of Dai Viet rests on who will strike first. The euphoria of capturing Thang Long quickly evaporated for Thod Hoan. His great victory was hollow. The city, which should have been their supply hub, was a deserted furnace. The Scorched Earth tactic was now fully operational. The Mongol army, designed for speed and combat, was suddenly paralyzed by hunger. This was the first phase of Tran Hung Dao's masterful counterplan.
Look at this. It's nothing but water.
The Mongol soldiers, mostly conscripted Song infantry, began to suffer. There was no fresh grain, no fodder for the thousands of horses. Thod Hoan looked at the smoking ruins and realized that his initial intelligence had been worthless. He had marched 300,000 men into a massive, meticulously planned logistical trap. His supply lines were dangerously long and easily raided by local militias. Thod Hoan's patience wore thin. As a prince, he was not accustomed to such squalor. Disease began to spread through the Yuan camp, weakening the conscripts. His victory had turned into a prolonged, miserable siege of an empty city. The initial Mongol confidence dissolved into frustration and anger. He needed food, and he needed it yesterday. All eyes turned south. The only hope lay with Toado and his southern fleet. Toado was supposed to bring supplies from Champa and link up with Thod Hoan's army. But the delay was crushing. Every day the armies remained separated. The logistical advantage swung further to Tran Hung Dao and the small, resilient Dai Viet forces. Thod Hoan knows he must act before his army starves to death or mutinies. He has a vast army, but it is quickly becoming a vast burden. The general must make a painful choice. Risk everything on one final, desperate push south to meet Toado, or abandon the field entirely. This desperate need for food is the weakness Tran Hung Dao has been waiting for. While Thod Hoan was mired in the logistical trap in Thang Long, in the relative safety of the rear, Tran Hung Dao was preparing for the final blow. He was in no rush. All elements, timing, terrain, and morale had converged to switch from defense to offense. The counterattack plan was a multifaceted maneuver designed not just to repel the Yuan forces, but to destroy their core units.
The time is right. I yielded the land, I yielded the city. Now is the moment to reclaim the entire nation.
The strategy was finalized with 3 decisive prongs of attack. The first prong, Tran Nha Duat was assigned the most critical task to strike at the UN Army's supply lifeline. He had to block Toado at the river mouth, the only route for the enemy's provision fleet. The second prong, Tran Quang Kai, would lead the elite forces to strike the abandoned capital of Thang Long. The goal was not only liberation but to completely sever Thoat Hon's retreat path. The third and most dangerous prong, Tran Hung Dao himself would lead the main army, waiting to deliver the decisive blow to Thoat Hoan as he was forced to flee Thang Long.
The enemy's arrogance has pinned them down. Now, their own desperation will guide them to the fate that awaits.
The crux of this plan was perfect time coordination. Tran Nhat Duat had to succeed first to force Toadu to change course, placing critical pressure on the starving Thoat Hoan. Tran Hung Dao knew his soldiers were exhausted after weeks of defense and the Scorched Earth policy.
Ride faster.
However,
Close the gap.
they possessed something the Yuan forces lacked: the fighting spirit of men defending their homeland. The final orders were passed. There was no grand assembly, no rousing speeches, only absolute trust in the competence of his generals and the will of the people. The moment of ordering the counterattack was the most dangerous, as it traded the safety of defensive tactics for a decisive victory.
Nhat Duat, Quang Kai, remember, I do not need a flashy victory. I need a thorough one. Use your minds, not just your might.
The generals Tran Nhat Duat and Tran Quang Kai moved swiftly. The two prongs of the attack began their movements simultaneously, one by water to sever supply, one by land to reclaim the capital. The atmosphere across Dai Viet changed. The tense silence of defense was replaced by the booming war drums of the counteroffensive. The real battle, where blood would spill and destiny would be decided, was beginning. The first crucial test of Tran Hung Dao's counterplan was assigned to his brother, Tran Nhat Duat. His mission was to intercept the colossal supply fleet of Toado at Ham Tu, the river gate to the north. Failure meant starvation for the Dai Viet and survival for the Mongols. Ham Tu was strategically vital, a narrow, complex stretch of the river where the vast Mongol fleet, designed for the open sea, would be most vulnerable. The atmosphere was one of quiet, lethal waiting. The fate of the entire war rested on this single naval engagement.
Do not slow the advance. We must reach the shore by nightfall.
Toado, confident and ignorant of the disaster unfolding in Thang Long, moved slowly. His fleet was heavily burdened with grain, fodder, and supplies, making it an easy target for fast, hit-and-run attacks. Tran Nhat Duat employed a disciplined strategy of attrition. He did not seek a full-scale battle immediately. Instead, small, swift units darted out, fired arrows, and disabled the lead Mongol vessels. They retreated quickly into the intricate maze of tributaries, rendering the Mongols' heavier warships useless. This guerrilla warfare on the water frustrated the Mongol commanders, who were unable to corner or decisively engage the elusive Dai Viet forces.
Reform the lines! Protect the barges! Do not let them through!
The true blow came as the Mongol fleet entered the tightest bend of Ham Tu. Tran Nhat Duat initiated a coordinated ambush, utilizing fire, ships, and strategically positioned archers hidden along the banks. The fire spread quickly across the tightly packed supply barges. The chaos was absolute. The Mongol soldiers, primarily seamen and supply handlers, were unprepared for the ferocity of the attack. The destruction of the supply ships was the core objective.
Keep pushing, men! Don't let
Grain
them
burned, supplies sank, and the immense logistical effort of Toado was reduced to ash and debris within hours.
Food lost here is a victory for our starving people in the north.
The battle was not about killing men, but about severing the lifeline of the entire invasion. The fire was uncontrollable. With his supplies destroyed, Toado was faced with a stark choice: retreat or attempt, a desperate push north with an empty belly. He chose the latter, foolishly hoping to meet Thoat Hoan. It sent a clear message to the Mongol forces that their supply route was gone forever.
To the Emperor! To Dai Viet! Victory is ours!
This victory was the turning point. It was the signal for the second and third prongs of the counterattack to be launched simultaneously. The morale of the Dai Viet forces surged. News of the burning Mongol fleet spread like wildfire, transforming fear into aggressive confidence across the land. The stage was now set for Tran Quang Kai to move on the empty capital of Thang Long.
Onward!
The two Mongol armies were now separate, confused, and irrevocably doomed by hunger and a lack of coordination. They were being hunted.
Get him! Hold him down! I will not yield! Who are you? Where is your fleet?
This war will not end easily. We must be prepared for the next phase.
Hamtu is ours. The Northern Star now belongs to Quang Kai. Our victory is assured. Now, forward to Thang Long.
With the Ham-Tu victory secured by Tran Not Duat, the signal was given for the second spearhead to strike. General Tran Quang Kai led the elite forces toward the occupied capital, Thang Long. The objective was simple: reclaim the city and completely cut off Thot Hoan's path north.
No time for glory, only action! The fire of Ham-Tu lights our path! Drive them out, now! Before their despair turns to rage! The wall is coming down! Retreat!
Intelligence confirmed the Mongols were starving and disorganized, their morale shattered by the loss of their supplies and the Scorched Earth policy. Thot Hoan received the devastating news and gave the humiliating order to abandon the capital. The Mongol forces, once an invading tidal wave, became a fleeing stream, disorganized and desperate to retreat south to the relative safety of the border.
Thang Long is not a prize of war. It is our beating heart. Show them the true, unleashed power of Dai Viet fury.
Fall back! To the gate!
Tran Quang Kai met minimal resistance. The few remaining Mongol soldiers were quickly overwhelmed by the ferocity and determination of the liberating army. The liberation was swift but solemn. Tran Quang Kai rode into a city of ashes in silence. The city was scarred, but the spirit of the capital was unbroken. Soon, the first weary civilians began to emerge from their hiding places.
We have reclaimed the land, but at what cost? We mourn the ruins, but we celebrate the future.
The sight of the returning citizens and the reclaiming of the Dai Viet flag marked the true emotional turning point of the war. Meanwhile, the disgrace of Thot Hoan's retreat was stark. He and his remaining troops were a defeated rabble, throwing away equipment to hasten their flight south. A humiliating failure after such an aggressive invasion. Their disorganized retreat proceeded exactly as Tran Hung Dao had calculated. They ran straight into the trap set by the main Dai Viet army.
He runs. Like a whipped dog, he runs directly into the maw of the trap. The lesson is learned. Now, the final hammer blow.
The irony of the Mongol strategy was sealed. Toa Do, pushing north with an empty fleet, was completely unaware that Thot Hoan was desperately fleeing south, resulting in a disastrous lack of coordination. Isolated and without a supply line, Toa Do was now navigating a river controlled by Tran Not Duat towards a city already secured by Tran Quang Kai.
The supplies are gone! The river burns! But my duty is to the Great Khan! I will push north! I will find the...
General, Thang Long is liberated.
In Thang Long, Tran Quang Kai swiftly consolidated his position, turning the liberated capital into a fortress. He was now positioned to join the main force and administer the final blow.
Fortify the gates immediately.
The stage was set for the final, decisive confrontation. The pursuit was on. The Mongol war machine had been broken into isolated, panicked fragments. Every village, every forest, and every river was now hostile territory. The victory was palpable. Only the final elimination remained. The main Dai Viet army was closing in from all sides.
No supplies. No reinforcements. No escape. My father's promise, a humiliating retreat.
The second phase of Tran Hung Dao's master trap was now fully engaged. the relentless pursuit. While Thot Hoan fled south, Toado continued north, directly into the waiting jaws of the Dai Viet forces. Tran Hung Dao delegated the chase, confident in his general's strategy.
The hour of the rout is upon them. No mercy for the vanguard. They must pay the price for their prince's folly.
Toado's forces were depleted and starving, forced to cross treacherous terrain like swamps and dense forests. They were constantly harassed by local militias, turning every step into a desperate fight for survival.
And is fleeing south. It is a trap.
The general finally received the intelligence that shattered his desperate hope. Thot Hoan had abandoned the capital and was in full humiliating retreat.
Thang Long abandoned? The prince fled? My duty, my supplies, all for nothing. We are cut off. We are doomed. We must secure the river crossing by dawn.
The realization of the trap was complete. Toado was completely isolated, far from any friendly force, surrounded by a hostile land. He attempted one final desperate order: flee towards the sea for a potential escape. But the Dai Viet pursuit was swift and precise. Tran Hung Dao's forces had already cut off the coastal routes, trapping Toado between the jungle and the sea.
Let no path remain open to the sea. The net is closed. We take the general alive, or we take his head. No quarter.
Form the circle. Weapons ready.
The encirclement was complete. Toado and his small loyal remnant were cornered in a narrow clearing. The Mongol forces, facing certain death, prepared for their final stand. The Dai Viet general commanding the pursuit gave the final order to charge. The short battle was brutal and swift.
I serve the great Khan faithfully. I will not kneel to these savages. Come then, you peasants. Come and claim my defeat.
The fall of Toadu was confirmed almost immediately. His death eliminated the last substantial threat to the Dai Viet's rear and neutralized the entire southern prong of the Mongol invasion.
My lord,
the captured banner and the news were sent immediately to Tran Hung Dao. The strategic elimination was complete.
One head has fallen. The threat of reinforcements is neutralized. The game is simplified. Now, we turn our full attention to the main quarry.
The focus shifted entirely to the main objective. Thot Hoan, Tran Hung Dao allowed the prince to escape along a specific, controlled route toward the coast, a move calculated to funnel him into the ultimate killing ground. The Mongol invasion was now reduced to a single, fleeing, humiliated prince and his small, terrified escort.
Gone. They are all gone. I escaped with my life, but nothing more. My glory, my name.
The long chase was over. Thot Hoan, the once proud prince, stumbled onto the coastline, his entire invasion force broken into a handful of terrified men. The sea was his last desperate hope of survival, a desperate escape from the hostile land that had consumed his army.
The land rejects us, but the sea is wide. We will escape this jungle, and I swear.
Far from the coast, Tran Hung Dao prepared the final, inescapable trap. His gaze fell upon the Bach Dang River Delta, a location of immense strategic importance where the tide could be weaponized. The final orders were given to prepare the stakes.
Faster!
The enemy approaches. The water is their strength, but the tide is ours. We will make the river our executioner.
Trained naval units worked tirelessly, hammering large, iron-tipped wooden stakes deep into the muddy riverbed. They were positioned to remain hidden beneath the surface at high tide, only to emerge as deadly defenses when the water receded. Meanwhile, Thot Hoan loaded his few remaining men onto hastily acquired ships.
He takes the bait. He sees freedom, but he sails toward doom. The tide serves Dai Viet. Let the...
Tran Hung Dao met with Tran Nhat Duat and Tran Quang Kai. The three generals confirmed the synchronized plan. The entire Mongol retreat path was calculated to funnel Thot Hoan's ships into the deadly delta.
All ships, full sail ahead. Do not look back.
Move, move, cut those lines now.
The prince of the great Khan, fleeing like a peasant. But I live.
I will not die here. This failure is temporary. The retreat is tactical.
Excellent progress, my forces.
As Thod Hoan's pitiful fleet began its journey, the final disposition of the Dai Viet forces was confirmed. Tran Hung Dao's army moved into their hidden, strategic positions, surrounding the river from the high ground.
The moment is upon us. The trap is sprung. Let the tide turn. Sound the horns.
Sound the drums.
A tense, profound silence settled over the river delta. The waters flowed calmly, concealing the 1,000 deadly points beneath. Thod Hoan's ships drew closer, unknowingly sailing on the surface of their own watery grave. The tide was at its peak, and the final moments of the invasion were ticking away with the current.
CO2's army poised on the banks.
The water is prepared. The general awaits. The final battle for the spirit of the nation is set.
The desperate flight continued. Thod Hoan and his decimated escort were pushed relentlessly toward the coast, every step calculated by Tran Hung Dao. The objective was simple: funnel the humiliated prince directly into the river mouth prepared for him.
Let them taste freedom. The pursuit ends here. Guide the mouse to the bottle.
As Thod Hoan saw the open water and the waiting Mongol transport ships at the mouth of the Bach Dang River, a desperate relief washed over him. It seemed, finally, an escape was possible from the hostile land.
The sea is salvation. I will never set foot on this cursed land again. Sail! Sail fast!
We strike with the morning tide. Ensure the timing is exact across all divisions.
It is confirmed. The coordinated attack...
The Mongol ships hastily began loading the prince, rushing toward the narrow passage. But waiting at the river entrance was the small, swift advance fleet of Tran Not Duat.
We must appear vulnerable before the main fleet arrives.
The Dai Viet ships positioned themselves to appear as a small, easy target, perfectly executing the planned feint attack.
Charge! Fight them, but do not win! Draw them deeper! The tide is turning! To the rails!
The initial clash began. The small Dai Viet fleet engaged the larger Mongol ships in a fierce skirmish, then suddenly executed a swift, coordinated retreat. The confident Mongol fleet, believing they had won the first naval encounter easily, rushed in pursuit, sailing directly over the hidden minefield of stakes.
The water hides the teeth. Their speed is their weakness. They sail blind toward their doom.
They are fully engaged over the stakes.
Tran Hung Dao watched from the high command post, patiently waiting for confirmation.
Yes, Commander.
A flag was raised, signaling the Mongol fleet was fully engaged and the trap was sprung.
Full speed! Give them no quarter! Let the final act begin! All forces, full...
The main Dai Viet naval fleet and fire ships, led by Tran Quang Kai, emerged dramatically from hidden coves and tributaries. The high tide had begun to turn. The Mongol ships realized they were now hopelessly trapped, surrounded on both sides of the river by the main Dai Viet force. Thod Hoan, from his transport ship, watched his final hope turn into a terrifying, organized ambush.
The ambush is set. They are encircled. This river mouth is the stage for their final judgment. They are trapped. Sound the war horns and prepare.
The Mongol fleet, believing they had finally broken through, suddenly found themselves completely encircled by the aggressive Dai Viet forces. War cries erupted, turning Thod Hoan's relief into pure panic. Tran Quang Kai's junks launched a massive volley of flaming arrows.
The fire is too strong, Commander. Unleash the fire. Burn their sails. Leave them no escape route. Defensive formation. Do not let them pass.
Tran Hung Dao, watching from the high ground, remained perfectly calm. The high tide was still at its peak, concealing the iron-tipped stakes beneath the turbulent surface. The initial chaos was necessary to draw the enemy deeper into the trap.
Let them chase shadows. The depth is our ally. They are already over the line.
Grapple the flagship.
Tran Not Duat led the light, agile junks in a fierce frontal attack, engaging the largest Mongol ships. The goal of this phase was to provoke the enemy into a blind, reckless pursuit upriver, directly over the concealed minefield. Thod Hoan, driven by panic and desperation, ordered his fleet to break through the blockade and escape to the open sea at all costs.
Break through the fire! Push them back to the shore! Our escape depends on speed!
Driven by rage, the Mongol fleet rushed forward, sailing deep into the delta. Their heavy hulls passed just inches above the deadly, submerged iron stakes.
They have crossed the line of
Tran Hung Dao's generals confirmed the crucial intelligence. The Mongol fleet had crossed the main line of the traps. The tide had begun its subtle, inevitable turn.
Feint complete! Withdraw! The main trap is set! Give the signal!
All ships, full speed ahead! Rush the flank!
The feint forces withdrew, and the final, decisive wave of attack ships rushed the flank of the now exposed Mongol fleet. They were fully surrounded and trapped in the narrow river mouth.
The river whispers its secret. The clock is ours. The water level will not wait for the enemy.
Pull harder, men! The current is against...
Panic seized the Mongol commanders as they attempted to turn their ships around against the flow of the current. On the riverbanks, Tran Hung Dao's archers rained down volleys of fire arrows upon the immobile ships. Thod Hoan watched helplessly as his final vessels burned. The water level was dropping rapidly. The mudflats were beginning to appear.
The final act has begun. The tide is turning. The fate of the Mongol fleet is sealed. The ebb current runs deep.
The strategy behind the Battle of Bach Dang was a masterpiece of scientific warfare. Tran Hung Dao did not rely on chance. He relied on the precise, predictable power of the ocean tide. The water's movement was meticulously charted and controlled.
The river does not lie. We studied its breath, its rhythm. Today, the tide is our strongest general.
Steer hard to port. We must reach the bank.
Now deep inside the delta, Thada Hoan's heavy ships struggled violently against the rapidly strengthening ebb current. Their lack of knowledge about the local waters became a fatal flaw. They were losing maneuverability by the second.
The moment of reckoning. They are caught between the Dai Viet fury and the silent teeth of the earth.
The water level dropped dramatically. Dai Viet officers, using simple calibrated wooden sticks, confirmed the precise depth. The lethal iron stakes were now mere inches beneath the surface. The river was closing its iron fist.
To battle, men of Dai Viet! Now, the water has given us the signal. Execute the plan. End this war. Fire the signal flare. Prepare for the advance.
Tran Hung Dao raised his hand, and a signal flare shot into the sky. It was the absolute final command. The main Dai Viet fleet instantly surged forward from their hidden coves. Thod Hoan saw the flare and the relentless attack, realizing his fleet was now completely immobilized, stuck fast in the mudflats above the hidden stakes.
Trapped! Immobile! The great Mongol fleet has run aground. The final slaughter begins.
The river's final betrayal had begun. The ebb tide accelerated, and as the water level plummeted, the heavy Mongol warships instantly lost all momentum. Their hulls scraped against the muddy riverbed, listing violently as they were snared by the hidden current. Then, the truth of the trap became agonizingly clear. The black, iron-tipped wooden stakes of the Bach Dang River began to emerge from the receding water.
Stakes! We've sailed over stakes! This is no river! This is a greyhound!
The hour is upon us.
Tran Hung Dao, standing high above the river, gave the final, cold order. The entire Dai Viet naval force, led by Tran Not Duat and Tran Quang Kai, surged forward toward the immobilized enemy. A sickening crunch echoed across the delta as the first major Mongol warship was impaled and ripped open by a massive wooden spike.
The river has devoured the fleet. Immobilized and helpless, the tide delivers its judgment.
Forward, through the rocks!
The chaos was absolute. Ships were stuck, sinking or burning. Tran Not Duat's junks, small and agile, easily navigated the newly shallow waters, positioning for the kill. They launched massive volleys of fire arrows, turning the delta into an inferno.
The target is fixed! Fire everything! Let the iron sink their arrogance!
We've struck the stakes!
Mongol resistance quickly crumbled. Stranded on the slippery, muddy decks of their trapped ships, the soldiers were unable to fight back effectively. The battle had turned into a relentless, brutal slaughter. Desperate Mongol soldiers abandoned ship, sinking into the thick mud as they tried to reach the shore, only to be met by waiting Dai Viet infantry.
The flow is broken. Their mobility is gone. Now, only the relentless elimination remains.
Thode Hoan watched in utter disbelief and collapse as the flagship nearest him was consumed by fire and began to sink slowly onto the stakes. His grand invasion was being dismantled piece by piece.
My men, my ships, my honor, all shattered on these cursed wooden spikes.
Press the attack! Send another volley of flaming...
Tran Quang Kai's forces maintained constant pressure, turning the scene of immobilization into one of utter defeat. The resistance was broken. The battle now entered the phase of control. Tran Hung Dao lowered his gaze. The grim satisfaction of a flawless strategic victory complete. The main Mongol resistance had ceased.
We are victorious!
Cease the arrows! Secure the prisoners! The battle ends now! The hunting begins!
Never! For the Great Khan! He's down!
The final act of resistance was short-lived. Thode Hoan's personal escort desperately fought a rearguard action to secure his escape. He was pulled away from the main battle and onto a very small, fast escape boat.
Let the prince flee with his life. He carries the greater shame. The invasion is dead. The invader lives to report it.
Maintain formation.
The scene after the battle was one of devastation. Smoke, fire, and the splintered wood of dozens of sunken ships. Dai Viet forces swiftly began securing prisoners and salvaging equipment from the wreckage.
A victory absolute. The sea is stained with the ruin of the Yuan dynasty's naval power.
Tran Hung Dao descended from the command post to meet Tran Not Duat and Tran Quang Kai on the mudflats. The three architects of victory shared a moment of profound, shared triumph. The captured Mongol standard was pulled down and thrown into the muddy water, symbolizing the definitive end of the invasion.
The Great Khan's forces, broken by mud and wood. The lesson will echo for centuries.
Final cleanup procedures initiated.
The sun set over the scene of destruction, casting long shadows across the broken fleet. The total destruction of the Mongol fleet at Bach Dang ensured that the Yuan dynasty would never again attempt a naval invasion of Dai Viet.
We protected the nation not just with might, but with knowledge. The river is our witness. The war is won.
The chaos of the initial clash gave way to systematic destruction. The UN fleet, immobilized and impaled, was a fixed target. Tran Quang Kai ordered a synchronized assault from both the river and the riverbanks, eliminating the last vestiges of resistance.
Do not let them break through! No time for mercy! Close the ranks! They are broken, now crush the will!
A long, slow sequence of destruction. Heavy Yuan warships splitting apart as their weight rested entirely on the iron stakes. Their commanders, unable to fight or maneuver, were quickly overwhelmed. Thode Hoan's personal guard fought desperately, physically pulling the prince onto a small, desperate escape boat to save him from capture.
Leave it! Leave everything! Save the prince! This defeat is not worth my life!
Final sweep!
Tran Not Duat led the final sweep, extinguishing any remaining floating resistance and ensuring the Yuan standard was torn down from the mast of the last flagship. The naval power of the Yuan dynasty was extinguished. Tran Hung Dao, watching through his spyglass, confirmed the strategic objective was complete. The Mongol capacity to invade by sea was eliminated.
The Yuan Navy is extinguished. Their capacity to invade is zero. The strategic objective is complete.
The battle transitioned into salvage and capture. Tran Quang Kai began organizing the massive cleanup operation. The scattered wreckage of the UN fleet served as a permanent, humiliating monument to their ambition.
We must clear...
The elimination of the Yuan naval power was absolute. Tran Hung Dao descended to the river delta floor, his boots sinking slightly into the exposed mud, surveying the wreckage of his masterpiece.
Let him go. Let the humiliation be his messenger. The greatest victory is not the killing of... Separate the generals.
The prince's small escape boat was intentionally allowed to reach the open sea. Thod Hoan was alive but utterly defeated, a living witness to his own failure. Tran Not Duat oversaw the capturing of all surviving Yuan generals. The final official count confirmed the total destruction of the fleet. The battle was over.
Quickly but carefully... The river is clean. The last great threat is broken. Sound the horns. The war is over.
The tides were
Soon,
monitored with
the
precision.
flood tide began its slow return, washing away the evidence of the slaughter. The river reclaimed its form, concealing the deadly stakes once more. A powerful symbol of nature returning to peace after serving the cause of Dai Viet.
The river reclaims its form. The water rises, washing away the blood, hiding the evidence of the greatest defeat in Mongol history.
Tran Hung Dao met with local militia leaders, thanking them for their essential role. He looked back one last time at the river, a final, rare smile of total victory on his face, before beginning the triumphant march home.
Go home, my people. The final lesson has been taught. This land is sovereign, and the price of invasion is paid in full.
The great battle was won, but the last image was that of defeat. Thod Hoan sailing desperately into the open sea, a prince reduced to a frightened refugee. He carried with him the ultimate humiliation, a living symbol of the Yuan dynasty's failure.
The work is finished. The cost was high, but the independence of our people is priceless.
Tran Hung Dao's forces efficiently secured the delta, dismantling the temporary wooden fortifications and loading the valuable captured Yuan supplies onto carts. The final act of war was logistics and cleanup. Thod Hoan's small boat eventually encountered a larger Yuan relief ship, allowing the prince to escape permanent capture and sail back north in disgrace. The victorious Dai Viet army began their long, triumphant march away from the river, greeted by cheering crowds in every regional town. Tran Hung Dao accepted the praise with the dignified humility of a general who understood the true weight of his victory.
Look upon the mighty Khan's commanders. They are broken. This nation bows to no man.
Your Majesty.
The final legacy was peace. Farmers returned to their rice paddies. Children played near the safe riverbanks. The vast, turbulent river delta, the scene of the ultimate slaughter, returned to its natural, calm state.
A general's true victory is not just in battle, but in the long, peaceful life he secures for his descendants.
The nation began the massive effort of rebuilding, symbolized by the vibrant life returning to the citadel walls of Thang. The war had proved that unity and strategic genius were stronger than overwhelming force.
The price of blood paid 1,000-fold. The nation lives. From the ashes of war, a new prosperity will rise.
The three generals, Tran Hung Dao, Tran Not Duat, and Tran Quang Kai, stood together on the citadel walls, looking out over the peaceful land, their mission complete. The Second Mongol Invasion had failed decisively.
My advisors, the Emperor expects us by nightfall. We must finalize the troop movements before then.
The Bach Dang River flows forever. And forever it will whisper